Okay, let's dive into something that, well, it really stirred up a global storm, didn't it? Edward Snowden. It forced us all to ask some incredibly complex questions.
Absolutely.
And let's forget the legal side for just a moment. The real debate, the one our source material today digs into, isn't about whether what he did was legal. It's about whether it was morally right.
Exactly. Because, as we often see, the law and, morality don't always map neatly onto each
Sure at
other.
all.
And to tackle that deep moral question, this analysis uses a specific philosophical lens. It's called contractarian theory.
Contractarianism. Okay, sounds like,
Right.
well, contracts, agreements.
Precisely.
Mm.
The core idea here, according to the source, is that morality, the rules of right and wrong, they don't just come from, say, a divine command or some inherent duty we have.
Right.
Instead, it sort of emerges from rational individuals agreeing to cooperate,
Mm.
even if everyone is primarily looking out for themselves. The source uses this term, non-tuistic preferences.
Meaning you're not, like, naturally putting others first.
Yeah, exactly. You're not naturally prioritizing others' well-being. But even then, you realize that agreeing to certain rules and working together, well, it actually serves your own self-interest best in the long run.
Huh. So it's less about being good just because, and more about figuring out the rules everyone can realistically live with because it benefits them individually.
That's the essence of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
The source contrasts this with theories like consequentialism, which just looks at outcomes, or deontology, which is all about duty. Contractarianism that's applied here is really about finding a way to satisfy everyone's interests through, well, mutual agreement and cooperation.
Okay, but if everyone's just self-interested, why would they bother agreeing to anything? Why not just, grab whatever you can get away with?
Well, that's the fundamental problem these agreements are designed to solve,
Yeah.
the collective action problem.
Right.
If we all just pursue our absolute best individual outcome without any rules, without any cooperation, our interests inevitably clash. Think of the classic illustration the source brings up, the prisoner's dilemma.
Oh, yeah, okay. Where if two suspects both stay quiet, they both get a light sentence. But if one talks and the other stays quiet, the talker walks free and the silent one gets, like, the maximum sentence.
Exactly that. Pure self-interest seems to dictate you should talk, right? Hoping the other person stays silent. But if both people act on that pure self-interest,
They both talk.
they both talk, and they both end up much worse off than if they'd managed to cooperate and both stayed silent.
So the risk of a really bad mutual outcome makes rational people willing to settle for a better mutual outcome through agreement, even if it wasn't their absolute first choice individually.
That's the logic, yeah.
Yeah.
Morality, when you look at it through this contractarian lens, is basically the set of rules that makes this necessary cooperation possible. It specifies requirements and permissions everyone agrees to follow.
And the source argues that a really, really critical condition for these agreements to work fairly is trust and full information.
Yes,
Which brings us right back around to Snowden, doesn't it?
it certainly does. Because this framework isn't just for, abstract thought experiments. You can use it to analyze real-world relationships and the agreements they depend on,
Like,
like the one between Edward Snowden and his employer, the NSA. And maybe even more importantly, the huge, complex, often unspoken agreement between the public and the state.
okay, so our mission in this deep dive is to use this specific contractarian framework, just as the source lays it out, to explore those relationships. We want to see what insights it offers into the morality of Snowden's choices.
And, the argument the source builds using this framework is, well, it's pretty thought-provoking.
I bet.
It suggests that the key to understanding the moral dimension here really lies in who owed what to whom, in the context of these different agreements, and crucially, whether the conditions for a fair agreement were actually being met.
Okay, let's start with that first layer then. The relationship between Edward Snowden and the NSA, his employer. I mean, most jobs involve some kind of agreement, right?
Right.
A contract of trust. You trust your employee to do the work, keep company secrets. They trust you to pay them, provide a safe workplace, that sort of thing.
And in a typical company, violating that trust, say by leaking confidential information, would clearly be seen within this framework as breaking the agreed-upon rules of cooperation within that specific employer-employee contract.
But as the source points out, an intelligence agency isn't exactly a typical employer, is it?
No, not at all. The power dynamic is, well, hugely asymmetrical. And the stakes of secrecy are framed as much, much higher, potentially impacting national security.
Right.
The employee is expected to safeguard the very nature of the organization's work. And as the source notes, someone like Snowden explicitly signed confidentiality agreements like the Standard Form 312.
SF 312,
Yeah.
okay. Which, to many people, makes his leak a really clear violation of trust and, an undeniable moral wrong within that specific agreement. Case closed, right? Simple.
Well, that's certainly one perspective, and it's reflected in a lot of the criticism of Snowden. But the source also presents Snowden's counter-argument, which adds a layer of complexity.
Okay.
He claims SF 312 is a civil non-disclosure agreement, and it's distinct from his oath to uphold the Constitution. He argues his actions were actually in defense of that higher constitutional oath, which he believed the state itself was violating.
So he's framing it as a conflict between two different obligations, two different potential agreements he was part of.
Precisely. And the source also considers the practicalities, like, could he have addressed his concerns internally? Snowden claimed he tried, though the NSA denies this happened.
Right.
The source even cites a national security reporter who suggested that internal channels for whistleblowers in this kind of environment are, well, effectively non-existent or often just lead to reprisal.
Which kind of points to the difficulty even within just that employer-employee dynamic of fulfilling your obligations or raising concerns when the power is so skewed and the internal cooperation mechanisms might actually be broken.
It certainly complicates the idea of a simple, fair agreement based purely on the employer-employee relationship, especially when one party holds almost all the power and controls the flow of information.
Okay, that makes sense for the immediate employer relationship, but the source argues the real contractarian analysis here, the deeper one, extends way beyond that. It goes to a much larger agreement, the one between the public and the state.
Yes, exactly. The foundational social contract. The source touches on ideas like, Hobbes's Leviathan, where citizens hypothetically agree to delegate power to a state to escape chaos and secure their interests, forming a commonwealth. It's kind of massive implicit agreement for cooperation.
And how do those contractarian conditions we talked about earlier, mutual interest, full information, how do they apply to something as, well, abstract as the relationship between the public and the state?
Well, for this hypothetical social contract to function fairly, to enable the broadest possible cooperation between the public and the state, the source argues there really needs to be transparency. There needs to be full disclosure of capacities and vulnerabilities by both sides, essentially.
So the public delegates power and resources, expecting the state to use them on their behalf, but within agreed-upon limits, like the law and the Constitution.
Right. And the state, represented by agencies like the NSA, needs to be upfront about how it's actually using that delegated power.
That seems logical.
According to the source, yes, at least in principle, for a truly fair agreement. But the source then highlights exactly where this breaks down in the Snowden case.
How so?
The NSA's mass surveillance practices, things like PRISM and the bulk collection of domestic phone metadata under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, these weren't being fully disclosed, not even to some of the official oversight bodies.
And famously, James Clapper, the director of national intelligence at the time, explicitly denied the domestic metadata collection program when asked directly by the Senate.
He did. So the state, which is a party to this larger social contract, wasn't being transparent about its actions. It was arguably violating the terms of the hypothetical agreement with the public.
Okay.
Precisely. And the source introduces a really insightful point here. It suggests the NSA was, in a way, engaging in a subversive use of contractarian principles itself.
How do you mean, subversive?
By exploiting the expectation of trust that's inherent in intelligence work. The need for employee loyalty and secrecy, the NSA could keep information about its controversial surveillance practices hidden from the public, the other party to the main agreement.
Ah, I see. So they were using the structure of trust and secrecy, which is necessary for some state functions, to actually prevent the disclosure that would be needed for a fair agreement with the public about those surveillance programs?
Exactly that. They were leveraging the loyalty expected within the organization to basically perpetuate an information imbalance in the much larger public-state relationship. The source argues this prevented the public from engaging in that hypothetical agreement from an informed position. The state was essentially acting outside the bounds that might achieve social consensus if people actually knew what was happening.
Okay, wow. This is where it gets really interesting then. If the state was, arguably, violating the conditions of the social contract by withholding crucial information, what does Snowden's action look like through this specific contractarian lens?
Well, the source argues that by revealing these practices, Snowden wasn't just breaking an agreement with his employer, the NSA.
He was doing more.
He was, from this specific perspective, correcting the state's violation of the larger, more fundamental agreement with the public.
He was leveling the information playing field.
Yes, exactly. By making the public aware of the state's actual capacities and actions in this area, he enabled the public, the other crucial party in that social contract, to engage from a significantly more informed position. It allowed for the possibility, at least, of a more genuinely cooperative agreement in the future, one based on knowledge rather than, assumptions or actively denied facts.
So the source's argument using this contractarian framework is that Snowden's actions, by fixing the information imbalance the state created, actually facilitated a broader form of cooperation within the social contract, cooperation that the state secrecy was actually undermining.
That's the central thesis presented in the source, yes. By enabling the public to understand the situation better and therefore represent its interests more effectively in that hypothetical agreement with the state, Snowden contributed to the conditions necessary for fair, more informed cooperation. And therefore, within this specific framework, the source concludes his actions were morally correct.
That's a powerful reframing. It really moves the moral analysis away from just thinking about employee loyalty and places it firmly within the context of that much larger fundamental relationship between citizens and their government, all analyzed through this lens of agreed upon rules and trust. So why is using this kind of abstract framework contractarianism? Why is that actually useful when we think about real-world, high-stakes situations like the Snowden revelations? What does it give us?
Well, I think it gives us a structured way to sort of dismantle these really complex ethical dilemmas. It pushes us to think about what agreements are actually in place, whether they're stated or just implied, and crucially, whether the conditions necessary for those agreements to be fair and effective are actually being met.
Okay.
It highlights that trust isn't just, a feeling. Within this framework, it's tied directly to transparency and balanced power in relationships, whether that's personal relationships or governmental ones.
It helps us analyze not just whether a specific rule was broken, but whether the whole system of rules itself is fair, whether it enables genuine cooperation based on mutual interest and, importantly, informed consent.
Exactly right.
Now, the source is also careful, though, to acknowledge the inherent tension here. I mean, the relationship between the public and the state, it isn't one of equal power, is it?
Not at all.
Yeah.
The state necessarily holds more power and, crucially, requires some level of secrecy, for legitimate national security reasons, for instance. Although we should acknowledge that national interest can be a very broad justification sometimes.
Sure.
Yes, and because of that inherent need for some secrecy, the implicit boundaries of the state's power within that social contract agreement will likely always be somewhat undefined. You can't spell out absolutely everything in advance.
Right. And if, as this contractarian theory suggests, fair agreements really require full disclosure and relatively equal standing.
Well, this brings us right to the provocative question the source kind of leaves us with to think about.
Which is,
given the state's inherent need for some secrecy and its significantly greater power and access to information compared to the public, can a truly fair, trust-based agreement, the kind contractarian theory describes as ideal, ever fully exist between the public and the state? Can the conditions for genuine cooperation based on full information truly be met in that relationship?
Can that ideal ever be fully realized?
That's something worth really pondering, I think.